How much money was stolen in the most famous train robbery in British history? £100,000 or £500,000? No, a staggering £2.6 million. In 1963, that amount of money could buy hundreds of houses, dozens of luxury cars, or build a small fortune. So how did a gang of criminals steal that much money from a moving train? This is the story of the Great Train Robbery. The robbery shocked the entire country and quickly became one of the most famous crimes in British history. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more incredible moments from history. Now, let's go back to the night of August 8th, 1963. On the 8th of August 1963, a gang of criminals carried out one of the most audacious robberies in British history. In the early hours of the morning, they stopped a Royal Mail train in rural Buckinghamshire and escaped with more than £2.6 million in used banknotes, worth over £50 million today. The crime would become known as the Great Train Robbery, and it shocked the entire country. Although the exact origin of the idea remains unclear, Bruce Reynolds is widely considered the mastermind behind the robbery. Reynolds was an experienced criminal who later described the operation as his Sistine Chapel ceiling. Alongside him were several key figures in London's criminal underworld, including Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, and Charlie Wilson. Together, they began planning what would become one of the most carefully organised robberies in British history. Because the core group had little experience with train robberies, they recruited additional help. They contacted a gang known as the South Coast Raiders, who already had experience robbing trains. This group included Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, Jim Hussey, and Roger Corddry, who was skilled at tampering with railway signals. Ronnie Biggs, who had previously met Reynolds in prison, also joined the team. In total, around 15 men would eventually take part in the robbery. Planning the robbery required more than just manpower. One member of the gang spent months befriending railway workers while pretending to be a railway enthusiast. He was even allowed to ride in train cabs and occasionally operate trains himself. The gang also reportedly received inside information from a mysterious figure known only as the Ulsterman. His true identity has never been confirmed. The gang targeted a Royal Mail travelling post office train that regularly ran from Glasgow to London along the West Coast Main Line. These trains carried registered mail and large quantities of cash being transferred between banks. Because the mail was sorted while the train was moving, security was surprisingly limited. This made the train an ideal target. The timing of the robbery was no accident. The weekend before the robbery had been a bank holiday in Scotland, meaning banks had been closed for several days. As a result, far more cash than usual was being transported. Instead of the normal £300,000, the train was carrying roughly £2.6 million. The gang chose a remote section of track near Sears Crossing in Ledburn. To stop the train, they tampered with the signal system. They covered the green signal light and powered the red signal using a battery, forcing the train to stop. They also cut nearby telephone lines so that the crew would be unable to quickly alert authorities. At around 3 a.m, The train approached the crossing. Driver Jack Mills saw the red signal and brought the train to a halt. When the crew attempted to contact the signalman, they discovered that the telephone lines had been cut. Moments later, the gang struck. Crew member David Whitby was overpowered, and the robbers entered the locomotive. During the struggle, driver Jack Mills was struck on the head and badly injured. The gang detached most of the train, leaving only the locomotive and the first two carriages, which contained the money. They had planned for one of their own men to drive the train to a nearby bridge where vehicles were waiting. However, there was a problem. The gang's driver had experience only with smaller trains and could not operate the newer diesel locomotive. In the end, the injured Jack Mills was forced to drive the train himself under threat. The train was moved about half a mile to Bredigo Bridge, where Land Rovers and a truck were waiting. The robbers formed a human chain and quickly unloaded the money sacks from the train. In less than 30 minutes, they removed over 2 tons of cash and loaded it into their vehicles. After leaving the bridge, the gang drove through the countryside to a hideout known as Leatherslade Farm. The property had been purchased in advance and was large enough to house the entire gang and hide their equipment. For several days after the robbery, the farmhouse served as their boss while they divided the stolen money. The stolen cash was split into equal shares among the gang members and a few key informants. Each man received a fortune. While hiding at the farmhouse, some members even played Monopoly using real banknotes, a detail that would later become famous in the investigation. The gang had planned to destroy the farmhouse after leaving in order to remove any evidence. But the man responsible for burning the building never carried out the task. As a result, the property remained filled with evidence: fingerprints, abandoned vehicles, equipment, and personal items. This mistake would ultimately lead the police directly to the robbers. Police from Buckinghamshire, the British Transport Police, and detectives from Scotland Yard launched a massive investigation. Within days, officers discovered Leatherslade Farm. Inside, they found a wealth of evidence, including fingerprints on a Monopoly board and a ketchup bottle, as well as postal sacks and banknote wrappers. Once the farmhouse was discovered, the investigation quickly gained momentum. Roger Corddry became the first man arrested, and soon others followed. By the end of 1963, most of the gang had been captured and brought to trial. In total, the robbers received sentences adding up to more than 300 years in prison. Bruce Reynolds managed to evade capture for several years. He eventually fled abroad, but was arrested in 1968 after returning to Britain. Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years in prison and released in 1978. Despite the arrests, only a small portion of the stolen money was ever recovered. Much of it disappeared forever. Several members of the gang later struggled financially, became involved in other crimes, or lived quiet lives after leaving prison. Over time, the Great Train Robbery became one of the most famous crimes in British history. Some of the robbers, particularly Ronnie Biggs and Bruce Reynolds, became unlikely folk heroes to parts of the public. The case also changed how British police investigated organised crime. The Great Train Robbery was a remarkable feat of planning and coordination. For a brief moment, it seemed like the perfect crime. But a single mistake, failing to destroy the farmhouse, left behind enough evidence for police to unravel the entire operation. What could have been the perfect robbery instead became one of the most famous criminal investigations in British history. What could have been the perfect crime instead became one of the most famous criminal investigations in British history. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history.